One of the toughest things to master as a lo-fi producer is breaking out of the loop. But honestly, with a few good habits, it really doesn't need to be a total nightmare. So today I'm going to be walking you guys through my process and sort of what I'm thinking about as I try to turn a loop into a finished song. So the first thing we're going to need is a loop. All right, so far we've got chords layered with a pad, a very simple drum groove, and then a really minimal counter melody on a flute. So that means tip number one is to keep your loop very simple. It's gonna be really tempting to keep building on the idea and expand it into what you think you want the song to sound like, but that's where you start getting stuck in the cycle, in my experience. As you keep adding layers, it's harder and harder to convince yourself to break out. So what I like to do is build sort of the minimal foundation of what I want the first drop to be, right? So with these really minimal components, I'm already thinking about splitting this loop out into its component parts and building out a skeleton arrangement. So let's do that right now. So we split by channel, select them all and drag them in, and then we can start thinking about what do we want this arrangement to look like sort of energy wise, and that can always change later, but let's figure, you know, maybe around a 2-minute song. That seems to be about the sweet spot for me. So, you know, 32 bars at 65 BPM feels just right. We don't want all the drums in the intro, definitely not the bass. We're not gonna have that melody come in just yet. So we'll start with the keys and the pad, some type of riser that leads into the first drop. We'll probably run through the chords twice, and then we'll drop back down. Often I'll do that taking out the bass, reducing to just the pad, maybe pulling out one of the melodies. And usually that middle section will be where you really have an opportunity to change things up from just the loop that you've built out. But for now, let's focus on sort of building that energy profile, and then we can pay attention to where it feels stale and where we think we need a real switch to happen. So let's say we take out some of our snare layers and the bass falls out. So it's similar to the intro, but some of the percussion stayed. And then we go back into the full loop into a nice mellow outro where we don't have the flute anymore, and maybe we do some effects to make it shrink on the way out. So once we've got this sort of skeleton arrangement, we can listen to it all the way through and pay attention really closely to when you get bored, right? So if it's by the end of the first section of that full loop, you know that you need another element in your main loop. But if it's not until the end of this middle section, then maybe you've got a full enough loop, and what you really need to focus on is just building like a simple melody to sort of carry the energy on top. So let's give it a listen and then see where we're getting bored, right? So yeah, by the second half of that first drop, the chords are already getting pretty stale. It's repetitive, and the flute is obviously doing the same exact thing. So I know that I want something to come in at measure 9. Now, I also felt that it was pretty boring in the intro, so something I'll do right away is say, let's figure out what it's missing. And of course, if you're familiar with lo-fi at all, we need a little bit of ambience, something to sort of set the vibe. So let's find some nice, maybe rain sounds. And then, of course, we need a transition to get us into the actual drop. Don't mind my dog. And then maybe we're feeling like it needs some type of rhythmic element, just something to give it a little bit of motion and life before the drop comes in. So let's think about something like a Foley loop or a shaker loop here. So I found this nice Foley loop. I think it's from one of Mondo Loop's packs. My dog is just going crazy right now. I'm sorry if you can hear that, but I am not going to stop because I will not be defeated by that tiny animal. Let's give it a listen to the things we've added and see how we like this updated intro. So yeah, that's already breathing a lot more life into it. It's feeling closer to a full song. I need to get this dog to shut up, dude. I'm gonna lie. So yeah, the texture and ambience has definitely already added some life to it, but it's still feeling a little bit thin, a little bit boring. I'm feeling like the rhythmic elements are lacking a little bit. So I want to see if I can find some type of shaker to give it a little bit more energy as that drop comes in. So that's feeling a lot more full to me. I still think it's gonna need an additional melody or maybe a change to the melody, but for now, I think I'm liking where this piece of the arrangement is to at least move on to the next section. So now we can start thinking about what's gonna happen in this middle section, maybe the bridge or the B section, if you will. So let's hear what it sounded like coming out of the A section into the B section and sort of think about what we can do to make this a little bit more interesting. So we definitely need some type of transition to bring it there, be it a filter sweep or some EQ changes or maybe some dropouts in the percussive elements, but definitely something to signal to the listener that's coming. That's number one. And number two, it's super thin right now, right? So I see this as a good opportunity to either A, change the chords or the rhythm of the chords that's being played on that main piano to give it a different feel than that A section, or B, introduce a completely new element to the song that sort of takes the shining spot. Maybe like a guitar would be something that I would do a lot in this case. I'm not sure which I'm gonna do just yet, so let's see what we're feeling. But first, let's tackle that transition. So I'll take a couple of these white noise transitions, and odds are we're gonna need a transition coming back in, so we'll mirror the same one. And now, let's think about maybe cutting the hi-hats out just after this last snare hit, and maybe no kick either. So that's definitely getting there. I think we can actually be a little bit more aggressive with the dropout by losing the Foley and the shaker. So I'm liking that transition there. I think it's a good movement of the energy. But let's test option number one, where we switch up sort of the rhythm, maybe the order of the chords. So we can make this pattern unique. So let's try maybe just switching the rhythm that's being played, give it a little bit more energy in this thinner part to sort of fill that out. We'll try some cuts on an offbeat. Add in another note outside the chord, give it a little bit of a unique flavor here, see what happens. So we can see how that feels moving from the first part into the second. Is it sufficient for a change? Do we still feel like we need more? This is really an exercise of sort of reflecting on what the loop had and what the song needs, right? So let's see what we think this song needs. So I actually think that does a surprisingly good job for just the first thing I tried. But I am kind of hearing something layering in with that rhythm. So what I'm gonna do is go into this labs number 2. I'm gonna try adding a Celeste or like a bell and just straight up copy that MIDI. Let's see how that sounds up the octave. So I guess another tip here is I'm hearing some harshness. It's not the tone that I really want, so I can't recommend enough that you mix as you go. If I know immediately that this isn't fitting in the mix the way I want it to, let's try to make it fit right now while we're working on it. I'm gonna get rid of all of the low end out of this because I really just want it to be sort of a shimmery, sparkling, high texture that layers up. So hopefully you can see that as I'm sort of working through this, I'm basically challenging the things that I initially came up with for the loop and trying to see if I can switch them a little bit, cut them out, bring them in, to immediately take what was a very simple loop and turn it into a skeleton of an arrangement. And once I've got sort of the full arrangement mapped out, that's when I start thinking about what the top line melody is going to be. That's when I really give it its true character. And then based on what I come up with for the top line melody, I'll usually end up adding and removing a few more like counter melody parts. And that's where I sort of start doing my like effects automation and volume automations to really give each part its own character. So because my computer doesn't really like when I run the amp sim and the guitar at the same time, I'm gonna click this thing off and then check back in when I feel like I've got some type of decent melody to show you guys exactly how I transformed what we have here into what we're gonna end up with. So give me, I guess you'll see me then, like, I'll be right back. All right, after experimenting with a few ideas and taking a quick break for dinner, I am back with the simple guitar part I laid down. It's not the cleanest take, you know, it's not like mixed super well, but I figured for demonstration's purpose. But this is an example of what I would probably do to take a loop that I didn't change very much in the B section and introduce some variance to it. So what you're gonna hear is that the first guitar that comes in is very simple, very minimal, giving space for that new melody that we added with the bell and the piano change on the chords. And then as it advances into the second drop, it's introducing a completely new melody that wasn't in the first drop to help the second drop feel completely distinct from the first, despite it being all the same chords and elements. So let's give that a listen and you can get a feel for sort of what I laid down here. hopefully you could hear that between bar 13 and 32, the guitar sort of went through 3 central melodies. So we're stacking guitar parts to sort of build out our now very well repeated chord progression that we built in our initial loop. And ultimately it gives this track sort of unique identity in each of the 3 distinct parts, where in part 1, the loop sort of builds out and becomes a track. In part 2, the loop is now changed by subtracting components and sort of switching the rhythm and the melody that's happening from those same chords. And then in part 3, the loop becomes essentially just the background while the guitar is the star of the show. So I hope this was a helpful sort of walkthrough to one of the approaches that I take to expanding my loop into a full song. It's definitely not the only way to do it. I'd be happy to make another video like this where I sort of walk through another approach that I really like sort of messing around with, sort of more of a traditional, truly different B section if you feel like this is still too repetitive for your taste, which is a totally fair argument. But yeah, I think that's all I got. So thank you guys for stopping by, and I will catch you next week. Peace.